Welcome to Podcast RX, a new monthly podcast from Diamond Pharmacy Services.
Each episode is a conversation with the men and women who make Diamond the nation's largest correctional pharmacy provider, Pennsylvania's largest independently owned long-term care pharmacy, and a trusted retail pharmacy and medical supply provider to many in Western Pennsylvania.
We chat with pharmacists, nurses, technicians, and other key personnel for a deeper look at the administrative, clinical, and logistical challenges of filling prescriptions and delivering healthcare, from our local counter to across the country.
And we also get the occasional glimpse into the professional journeys of our guests and why they chose the careers in pharmacy and healthcare.
It's unlikely that you'd ever think of a healthcare professional as someone who cares too much. After all, that's the objective of their calling. But make no mistake, compassion fatigue is a real phenomenon, and it can take its toll on even the most seasoned healthcare professional. In this episode, we're joined by Karen Harrell. She's a registered nurse. She has decades of experience in managing assisted living communities. Karen recently presented on compassion fatigue at several of our 2019 educational conferences. She gives a rundown of the warning signs, the symptoms, and provides a few tips to help long-term care workers confront this sometimes debilitating condition. I'm Ashley Fritz, and this is Podcast RX. Welcome, everybody, to Podcast RX. This is Ashley Fritz. I'm here today with Karen Harrell, and we're actually coming to you live from our Indiana Diamond Educational Conference. So if you hear some background noise, we got a lot of folks here today, vendors and attendees, and we're having a great time talking about some great topics. And Karen, that's actually why I have you here today. Later on, you're going to be talking about compassion fatigue, which I think it's a great topic. It's something we don't talk about enough. So can you please tell me, what is compassion fatigue?
Compassion fatigue is when someone is emotionally and physically exhausted. They've given everything they have to give, and there's just nothing left. Work takes priority over everything in their life, and it's detrimental.
So Karen, as you know, we're at the educational conference today, and we're speaking to healthcare personnel. And in your presentation, you use this fantastic acronym for FINE, and it's feelings inside or never expressed. So in your experience in healthcare, how often do you see this among healthcare personnel?
I think it happens all the time. I think it's almost an expectation, especially when you go into nursing or the healthcare field, that we're caregivers. We're supposed to be providing the care. And I think we forget about ourselves, and we almost wall that off. We've got this thing that we pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and we just get out there and do the work that needs to be done. And we forget that we also need our own care.
Absolutely. So I can see this is something you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, every day, the stress of the job, the stress of caring for folks who need you. And of course, you're developing emotional attachments to these people. I mean, we're human after all. But when do you need to be actually worried about compassion fatigue?
I think compassion fatigue needs to be looked at as an occupational hazard. You know, we do training for back safety, bloodborne pathogen, and I think we should be doing the same thing for compassion fatigue. It's something that every caregiver can slide into if they're not careful.
Absolutely. Do you have, if you don't mind me asking, do you have personal experience with this?
I do. I've been in healthcare for 17 years, and I think I had done pretty well until a couple years ago when my own mom had to go into assisted living for Alzheimer's. And I thought I was doing a really good job until I kind of got myself stuck into some situations there where I was picking up on some of my own anger and irritability and just not really handling that whole grieving process very well.
Right, and you're burning the candle at both ends.
Yes.
I've seen it in my own family as well. My mom went through a situation in caring for her parents as they aged, and I just saw her run ragged. And it was something really, I could see it easily on the outside, but I know when she was in it, she didn't quite see that she was dealing with it.
Yes.
So let's delve a little deeper into the subject. Let's talk about some of the elements surrounding compassion fatigue.
Okay.
And one element that you mentioned that can be a contributor to it is trauma. So how would you define trauma in regards to the LTC healthcare setting?
I think sometimes we don't think we experience trauma in long-term care. We think, well, they do in the ER, maybe in pediatric oncology. But I think if we look at long-term care, we forget that we have our own trauma. And it's what I call relational trauma. These residents are with us for months, if not years. We tell families they're like our own. We treat them like they're our own grandmother or grandfather. This is their home. Yet when these people are declining, we don't accept that as we're losing someone who's declining who is like a family member.
And that's just it. I think a lot of times in this setting, a lot of times the healthcare workers are spending as much time, if not more, with the individuals in the family.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So you can see how that could absolutely play a part in day-to-day emotional stress.
Absolutely.
So what kind of resources are available, or I guess maybe the question should be, how can a healthcare worker deal with, let's say you have a favorite resident, for lack of a better phrase, that you're caring for day in, day out for months. And then after the loss of that resident, what's something that they can do?
I think, first of all, we have to acknowledge that was painful. Healthcare workers a lot of times need a tough exterior, but still have a nice, warm heart. And I think that is a skill that we have to teach people. I don't think they come to us equipped with that. So I think we have to give our staff time to talk about a favorite resident. And how do we recognize that resident? Do we put up their picture in a special place? Do we have a memory book? Do we talk about the resident? What we used to do at one of my communities was we would be in the room together before the resident was removed. And we'd talk about the resident and what they meant to us and what they brought to us that was special.
Well, yeah, and I think it's true of most people in healthcare. You get into the field because you have that heart of compassion. You have that heart of caring, and that results in caring for people. And unfortunately, not every outcome is going to be a positive one. So getting back to some of the things you talk about in your presentation, along with that, you define compassion as consciously sympathetic of others' distress and desire to alleviate it. And that's a tall order for anybody in healthcare or otherwise. So the drive to do this in a healthcare setting and with the elements of trauma we've spoken of, that can lead to burnout. So let's talk a little bit about burnout. How would you define that?
Burnout isn't quite as bad as compassion fatigue. So it's kind of like the precursor, the dress rehearsal. And burnout is when our worldview hasn't changed yet, but we've become disengaged. So we see our residents, we know they still need our help, but we just can't give that part of our heart to that. So we almost become robotic in the workplace.
And what are some of the consequences in the work environment of that, almost kind of that detaching?
Well, if you've got a lot of staff members doing it at the same time, your families and your residents can pick up on, they are here and they care for my mother, but they don't necessarily care about my mother.
Yeah. And that can really, I would suppose, damage the relationship between the residents, the families, and the healthcare staff. You could maybe lose some of that trust if you think that some of that care, care has slipped. So with all of these kinds of factors in place, it's kind of a tinderbox for compassion fatigue. I can understand why this is so common. The emotional stress, the burnout. What are some of the actual symptoms once someone's crossed the border from burnout into compassion fatigue? What are some of the symptoms there?
Probably the biggest one that we need to be alert for is anger and irritability. And your anger and irritability are out of proportion for the event.
Right.
So maybe you're walking down the hallway at work and you hear everybody laughing in the staff lounge. Now you know for sure you're the only one who's working in that place. Or maybe you're in a staff meeting and they're rolling out a new process. No one asked you. You know it's not going to work because no one asked you, and you become very angry and very frustrated.
Right. So the response just isn't proportionate to the actual action.
Exactly.
What are some other symptoms?
That we can have insomnia, or we can have changes in the sleep pattern. So maybe someone's sleeping all the time, or they're not getting restful night's sleep. There's a situation where maybe you sleep well at night, but during the day you're so tired that you can fall asleep anywhere at any time.
Wow. So some of these symptoms, I mean, they're all problematic.
Yes.
But some of them are downright dangerous.
Yes.
What are some of the more dangerous symptoms of compassion
Well,
fatigue?
if you look at it, something like hypochondria, being a hypochondriac is not unusual for healthcare professionals, but usually we realize it and we can step out of that. But with compassion fatigue, we can no longer separate that. So we get stuck in this cycle. Every headache is a brain tumor. Every gurgle of the stomach means something catastrophic is going on. And what we try to then to do is we try to medicate that. So maybe we're taking alcohol or using medications. The problem is the body still remembers that you had anxiety and all you're doing is bearing it.
So this really is something that could have extreme personal health consequences outside from even like a mental health and an emotional health. We're talking physical health as well.
Physical health and relationships, because if it's impacting your relationships at work, more than likely it's also impacting your relationships at home. Family may say you're disengaged. You're here, but you're not available to us. And then with compassion fatigue, sometimes the person that's suffering with it just doesn't see themselves as good enough. They're not a good enough mother. They're not a good enough spouse. They're certainly not a good enough nurse.
So if they don't realize that this is really kind of a result of compassion fatigue, what are some of the consequences?
Well, with compassion fatigue, we can have anxiety, depression, there can be addictions, and there can be suicide too.
Wow. Okay, Karen, a very serious problem. We're going to talk more about it. We'll be back with you in just a few moments on Podcast RX. We're going to take a quick break from this dialogue to bring you more dialogue. In this case, dialogue, DIALOG, stands for the Diamond Information and Learning Opportunities Group. It's Diamond's in-house speaker and continuing education bureau. If you have a group or facility with continuing ed needs, Dialogue can help set up an in-service for you. Our expert speakers and educators include pharmacists specializing in gerontology, anticoagulation therapy, and HIV. And we also have certified registered nurse practitioners and educators who specialize in disease states and well-being, and also numerous professional staff with expertise in everything from human resources management to safety and disaster preparedness. Dialogue also offers an LPN IV certification program for licensed practical nurses in Pennsylvania. This 8-hour course is approved by the PA State Board of Nursing to satisfy the mandated regulation to allow an LPN to manage and initiate IV therapy. This class is only open to facilities, organizations, and groups of 5 or more. For more information on courses and continuing education opportunities, please contact Trina Plazio at 800-882-6337, extension 1100. You can also visit diamondpharmacyLTC.com/learn/dialogue. And now, back to Podcast RX. Welcome back to Podcast RX. This is Ashley Fritz. I'm here with Karen Harrell, and we are talking about the very serious topic of compassion fatigue. And Karen, we were talking in the last segment about the emotional, the mental, the physical symptoms of compassion fatigue and how serious they are. And I do think most healthcare workers listening could see that they maybe have one or more symptoms of compassion fatigue. So let's talk about some contributing factors in the healthcare service environment and to why this is almost like an epidemic in this profession.
Okay. Well, contributing factors are things like your home life. If you're having troubles at home, it's possible that you're going to bring it to work with you as well. If there's marriage problems, financial problems, kid problems, it's going to be hard not to take that to work with you. So what we're seeing happens when you're in the workplace, and let's say you have a resident that has Alzheimer's disease, and you see that decline, and you see what's going on with them, and then maybe you go home and you see that your mother or father was recently diagnosed with Alzheimer's or dementia. You know what's ahead. Yeah. You can see that, and that can be very frightening. That can put a lot of fear into your heart.
Of course. So in some ways, maybe there's some transference with some of the things, the difficult situations you're witnessing at work. You can kind of bring those home with you for sure.
Right. Also, insufficient training. I see that happens a lot. Some of the different buildings that I'm in when I do some consulting work is maybe aides are put onto the floor before they're ready. Maybe aides are put on the floor before they've had adequate training.
Right.
Or maybe a new resident moves in and they don't have a plan of care. They don't have a task sheet. So we put them in a situation where they're not sure what they're supposed to do.
Sure.
Maybe nurses are trying to use a new electronic MAR system and they have no idea what they're doing.
Yeah, and the stress of the unknown, and combined with like duties that need to be done, I'm sure it can be a lot.
Lack of leadership is also a big contributing factor. Sometimes if we have a boss instead of a leader, that can be very difficult.
How would you define the difference?
A leader is someone that shows their staff what to do and the staff follows them. A boss gives a lot of orders and doesn't check back, doesn't see where the staff is at, doesn't really always understand the task at hand. I've had a boss who he would willingly admitted that he never gave anyone a compliment or words of encouragement because then he knew they would stop trying too hard. I had a wellness director who admitted to me that she hid in her office when difficult family members came in, or hid in a storeroom because the aides probably caused the problem anyhow, so they could handle it themselves.
Okay. So that's a problem.
Can be situations. I had a situation a number of years ago where a headhunter came to me and offered me a job, and that should have been my first red flag. The second one was he offered me a very large sum of money to leave a regional position and be a executive director. In the interview process, I was told that the occupancy was 97%, which is pretty good. I wasn't interested in doing another turnaround at that point in time. My first day of the new job, I found out the occupancy was actually 79%, and I was their 15th executive director in 36 months.
So that definitely speaks to some root issues
Yes.
at a facility level for sure.
Absolutely.
So what are some things? So say you're maybe a healthcare administrator and you're listening and you're like, you know what? They're not that one that doesn't care. They care about the well-being of their staff and their facility. And they're like, I'm hearing some of these things. I know we have some of these problems with my workers and compassion fatigue. What can they do?
First thing is they have to address the problem and say to the staff, this is almost an expectation that this is going on. I wouldn't start on day one calling it compassion fatigue, but maybe actually sitting down with the staff and asking them about their workload.
Right.
And actually hearing them. And they're going to talk about their schedule, and they're going to talk about how the showers aren't divided up fairly, or the medication administrations are not divided up fairly. So really listen and show them that you want to fix things. We should really try very hard as managers to make sure our staff have at least one uninterrupted break a day. And I know that's really hard when the day is very busy.
Of course.
But that's what's needed to keep our staff feeling heard and taking time for themselves, and maybe just sitting and having a cup of coffee before they go out and do the next difficult task.
Next difficult thing.
Yes.
So I know, like in the last few years, it seems like this country has really started to think more about the importance of mental health.
Yes.
I think sometimes in years past, it's something that's been pushed to the side just because we all have very busy lives and we don't always focus on ourselves and our own mental well-being. Do you think now with that shift, we're seeing people in a healthcare setting pay more attention to the signs of compassion fatigue?
I think so. And I think a lot of it has to do with turnover. If we're not taking care of our staff, they leave.
Right.
So I think we're reaching out, we're trying to find ways to keep our staff there and to keep them happy and to keep them healthy.
And that's all positive. That's a good thing. That's definitely steps in the right direction. I think that the more healthy healthcare staff that you have, the better care the residents are going to receive and the happier the families are going to be. It's just a win. It is a win for everybody involved.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for listening to Podcast RX, a production of Diamond Pharmacy Services. While we're taking a break here, we'd love it if you took a moment to follow Diamond on one or more of our social media platforms. On the corporate end, you can follow us on Twitter @DiamondPharm, connect with us on LinkedIn via our Diamond Pharmacy Services company page, and also subscribe to our Diamond Pharmacy Services YouTube channel. Our long-term care division has a Facebook page, and you can find that at facebook.com/DiamondPharmacyLTC. They also have a LinkedIn showcase page. Just search for Diamond Pharmacy Services Long-Term Care Division. If you're a listener in our hometown of Indiana, Pennsylvania, our retail drugstores and medical supply stores also have a social media presence. Find them on Facebook, page name Diamond Drug Stores and Medical Supply, on Instagram @diamonddrug.medsupply, or you can subscribe to the Diamond Drugs YouTube channel. We really appreciate your support of the podcast and would appreciate your likes and follows on these social media channels. Now back to the show. Welcome back to Podcast RX. This is Ashley Fritz. I'm here with Karen Harrell, and we've been talking about compassion fatigue. There's a lot of layers to this. There's a lot of things to understand. And Karen, in the first segment, we were talking about some of the symptoms of compassion fatigue. And some of them are kind of obvious, perhaps like irritability, just general being tired and things of that nature. What are maybe some of the less obvious symptoms that someone might experience?
So what we can also see is an increased use of drugs and alcohol, other addictions like shopping and hours on social networking sites, absenteeism. And absenteeism is in someone who has always been someone that's been at work and done their job. Suddenly they're taking a lot of days off. And they might even call them mental health days.
Right.
Another one is avoiding difficult conversations. So avoiding difficult conversations. No one likes to have a difficult conversation with a staff member, like you need to shower before you come to work or you need to wear underwear. But these are conversations that the person with compassion fatigue just doesn't have. They can't come up with the list of the problems. They can't come up with resolutions. And the most important part is they don't see the ramifications of not having that conversation.
Right. So some of the symptoms you mentioned that are concerning are possible, like substance abuse, or even something perhaps like an increase in like a shopping addiction or something like that. What do you do though if the person affected is kind of hiding those symptoms? Are there more things that we can look for?
So if we think someone's hiding it, obviously we're going to see things like maybe an increase of alcohol, and some of that will be obvious. Maybe if there's an increase in shopping, we'll see that on the front porch when we get home from work from, Amazon.
Sure.
But I think then if we're suspicious of that, maybe just trying to gently go into a conversation with the person and saying, how are you doing at work? How are things going? Trying to avoid yes, no questions, but really seeing, well, what's going on with your residents? How are things? See if you can't open a conversation with them.
Sure. So what would you say to somebody right now if you were talking to, let's say, a nurse who's working double shifts on the regular at her facility, and she's obviously very overwhelmed. Maybe she's got a family at home to take care of too. It's a common situation. Well, if that nurse is listening right now and is somebody who's suffering with compassion fatigue, what would you say to them?
Do you really need to do the double shifts? And I know there are some financial reasons that people need to do the double shifts, but sometimes people with compassion fatigue really can get an exaggerated sense of responsibility. They say, if I don't give Mary her shower, no one will. If I don't pick up this extra shift, no one will. So they can actually get themselves stuck because they are dependent on being needed.
That's a really interesting thought right there. They're dependent on being needed.
Yes, that's how they feel full. That's how they feel they have a purpose if they're taking care of others. So what we need to help them do is say, but you also owe it to them that you're a healthy, full caregiver. And so if you're going to work your double shifts, that's fine. But at some point in time, you need to make sure you go out and you have a lunch that's quiet. You have a bowl of soup and a salad, something that you do for yourself, even if it's something small, like making sure you get a good lunch once a week.
And that was actually going to be my next question. What's maybe some practical advice you would have? Like read a book, take time to watch a TV show you like, or something along those lines. What are some practical things that they can do?
And you've got some of those. You've got to take the time to say, I'm doing this just for me. Maybe it is maybe a new hobby. Maybe it's finding something like, for me, it was baking with yeast. I could never bake with yeast. I decided I was going to do that. So now it's baking.
Yeah.
And then when I'm done, I can see the result and I can share that result with others. Maybe it's gardening where you can see things that are alive and living and beautiful and full of color. But trying to find something other than the workplace. You have to separate yourself. So you need some kind of end to your workday and the beginning to your own life. So whether it's putting on comfortable pajamas when you get home, or listening to good music, or having a good CD on, something needs to mark work from home.
Right.
I read a story about a gentleman that worked in ICU, and every day he would get home from work and he would go and touch a tree in his yard. And his neighbor said to him after months of observing this, "What are you doing?" And his response was, "I hang the sadness, the trauma, the disappointments of my workday on the tree. And then I'm hoping then that the sun will bleach them or the wind will blow them away. And then I can go in and I can have my home life as well."
That's really good.
So for him, it was a tactile way to separate the two lives, the two different worlds.
Right, a cue just to kind of transition into the other part of his life.
Yep.
So, Karen, if you don't mind if I get a little personal again with this question, in your experience, I know having gone through some caregiver fatigue and things like that on your own, if there's somebody listening who maybe doesn't realize that they're going through this, what were some things that helped you recognize it within yourself?
Probably just being exhausted. Even after a weekend off, even after a good night's sleep, just being exhausted. Getting to work and saying, I really don't want to be here, but I have to be because there's no one else in the world to take care of my residents. Probably that irritability and anger thing where I could look and say, a family member comes in and says, "You guys lost Mom's blue sweatshirt," which I knew was 20 years old. And, to recognize that in myself, that there's no need for me to be getting upset over something like that.
Right.
So that's how I started to recognize it in myself and say, this is inappropriate. This is just not appropriate, and I'm not helping them. I'm not helping me, and I'm not helping my family. So I better do something about that.
Right. Right.
Just like if we had high blood pressure, we would do something about that, or high blood sugar. So we need to look at compassion fatigue as the same thing. We need to address the issue. We need to get help. If we can't resolve it within ourselves or in our workplace, when we're talking with staff members, then maybe we do need to go to our physician and say, I'm really having struggles with this. Most facilities or communities now have employee assistance programs. And if you're going to go to a counselor, you need to go to a counselor that is familiar with compassion fatigue.
Absolutely. So shifting gears for a moment, we're here today at the Indiana Educational Conference with Diamond Pharmacy Services. You maybe can hear some of the stuff going on in the background. We have a lot of folks and vendors and great speakers here today, including yourself. And you're going to be talking to a room full of healthcare professionals about this topic, and I know you've done it before. So how has this presentation been received?
Yes, I got to do this presentation in Columbus last week, and staff were very engaged. And as I'm going through the conference and I'm listing all the signs and symptoms, I'm asking them to use a check mark. So I have a sheet with it, and they check everything off. And I'm surprised. Some people have one or two. And what I tell them, then that is awesome. Then you can be a leader in your community to get your staff on the healthy track. But if they have more than 3, 4, 5 symptoms of compassion fatigue, it's time for them to stop and to think, so what am I going to do about this? And I've asked them to take one action a week and say, okay, this week I'm going to kind of look and see, is my anger out of proportion? Did I not need to get as upset as I did with that staff member? And so start identifying things.
Helpful advice. Karen, thank you very much for being here
Thank
today.
you.
We appreciate you being here at the conference to speak as well. I know your presentations always go over great.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us here on Podcast RX.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Karen Harrell for sharing her expertise on this serious yet understated topic. If you're listening and you think you might be suffering from compassion fatigue, there are some self-tests out there that can be a first step in addressing the problem. The Professional Quality of Life, or ProQOL test, is one example. This free self-assessment can be found in several languages at proqol.org. The test has subscales for compassion satisfaction, burnout, and compassion fatigue. A good overall resource for this topic is www.compassionfatigue.org. The site features plenty of articles and advice for dealing with compassion fatigue. And of course, no online test or article beats the advice of a qualified healthcare professional. And if you're struggling with any of the symptoms we discussed today, please seek their help. You'll find all the information I just discussed in the show notes of our podcast homepage. Thank you again for listening to Podcast RX.
This podcast features conversations with healthcare professionals. Their statements and opinions discussed herein are for informational purposes only. This podcast should not be considered professional advice and should not be used as a substitute for the advice of an appropriately qualified and licensed healthcare professional. Therefore, listeners must not rely on the statements made herein.
Podcast RX is a production of Diamond Pharmacy Services, the nation's largest correctional pharmacy provider. Find new episodes of the show on SoundCloud, Stitcher, and Google Play. And please subscribe, share, and leave us a review. Music by Maximiliano Silvera, sound expressed by Getty Images.